All right, you guys, welcome back to the next episode of the EchoCast. We're here with Paul again, and we got talking a little bit long the last time. We're gonna try and keep this one a little bit more to a specific topic, but you know how things go. Maybe we get off on some tangents. We'll try to keep things relatively stable though, because today we have an interesting topic, one that you guys are very, very interested in, and it's all the rage at the moment, and that is stretch-mediated hypertrophy and how it is going to turn you into the next Ronnie Coleman just from doing stretch position work. Isn't that right?
Of course.
All right, so we'll let Paul get into exactly what stretch-mediated hypertrophy is, what it is not, and how you could practically apply or not apply to your own training.
So I think that it's really important for people to understand that when we talk about stretch-mediated hypertrophy, we're talking about a very specific type of adaptation that happens basically inside the muscle. And that is there's an increase in number of sarcomeres in the series and an increase, basically the proxy for letting us know that stretch-mediated hypertrophy occurred in research is that they measure the fascicle lengths. And if we see that there's a fascicle length increase, man, I'm going to get back to all this.
Yeah, I was going to say, you got to tell people what sarcomeres and fascicles are.
If you're going to give me 1 minute, I'm going to explain that.
All right.
And then if you measure the fascicle, then we say, oh, there was an increase in sarcomeres in the series, the fascicle length increase, so stretch-mediated hypertrophy occurred from stretch. So I want everybody to think about this, start at the whole muscle. Right, Joel? So you have your bicep, and inside that bicep, you have fascicles, okay? And then inside those fascicles are made up of the muscle fibers. So lots of people just think of muscles and they say fibers, and they don't understand. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have the whole muscle, and then you have the fascicles, so like your little cylinders. And then within those, you have all the muscle fibers that fill those up. And then inside the muscle fibers, there's things called myofibrils or myofibers, right? And then inside those, there's these things called sarcomeres. And the sarcomeres are really, they're super tiny, of course, obviously. And then those are the actual functional proteins that cause contraction. They also, depending on their length, can also create what's called passive tension. So whenever you flex your arm, that is what we think of as like active, because there's a active concentric contraction going. And then when you lower, right, then if the sarcomere can get stretched out far enough, there would be something called passive tension generated by this really large protein molecule in those sarcomeres called titin. So when titin gets lengthened out, it has its own length to tension relationship. So it has a compliance segment. So if you stretch, the compliance segment gets stretched out. And then there's a little bridge that attaches to this another segment that is the stiff segment. Now that stiff segment is, when you do strength training, is the segment that gets lengthened out that causes all this passive tension. Okay? So you think of passive tension, and then active tension, and then you have total tension that comes from basically adding those two things together. If a muscle is going to get stretch-mediated hypertrophy, which means it's going to get those sarcomere things, it adds them in a row, right? One on top of the other in a series. It's literally called serial sarcomere number addition. So if you have that passive tension occurs, because the adaptation is that titin, that large protein molecule, gets lengthened, then the body will start adding those sarcomeres in a series. This is stretch-mediated hypertrophy. Now, the issue is not all muscles have sarcomeres that reach and stretch out that far. So they don't all get that passive tension dose.
To that, would they not all get it, or would they not all get it to the same degree?
They're not all going to, let's say the best way to describe that is some muscles will get that dose of passive tension faster as those fibers lengthen, or really as the sarcomeres lengthen, because it's the sarcomeres lengthen that causes the passive tension. So we'll take the quads, for example. So the quads have sarcomeres that get lengthened out like really, really quickly, right? So you don't have to get as much of that, like when people talk about making sure you get a full knee flexion, fully lengthened quads, and all that kind of stuff. The passive tension that you're going to get from the quads, they get into that passive tension area very quickly. Whereas another muscle you may lengthen that muscle out, but the sarcomeres just barely get to that point for those sarcomeres where they may experience like some. So it's kind of a magnitude thing along with the fiber length thing.
When you say very quickly for something like the quads, are you saying that you don't need to have the full knee flexion in order to get it?
Yeah. Okay. Because, and I don't know how, there's the length of tension relationship. You have this kind of little curve, and it's like the ascending limb, the plateau, and then the descending limb. So this describes the working sarcomere length. So if the sarcomere is on the ascending limb, what that means is that the sarcomeres get very short and cannot experience mechanical tension because they don't have enough sufficient overlap between those actin and myosin filaments. All pretty much sarcomeres, except the calves, get on the plateau, and that's where they experience the greatest amount of overlap, so they produce the most significant amount of force. And this is usually at moderate muscle lengths, which is important to keep in mind for the remainder of this discussion. Okay. If the sarcomere gets stretched out to that descending limb, that's when that great big large molecule called titin basically gets lengthened, and there's passive tension. And it detects its own passive tension. It's a cell mechanoreceptor. So it actually is able to add that to that total tension amount that you get from the active and passive tension. Now that's on lengthening. When you shorten a muscle, that gives you a completely type of adaptation. And this is the part I think people are confused about. So when you lengthen a muscle out, you're getting a specific type of adaptation, stretch-mediated hypertrophy. But as soon as you start to shorten, when you're contracting that, you'll get a completely different type of adaptation. You get something called myofibrogenesis. So sarcomerogenesis is stretch-mediated hypertrophy stuff. Myofibrogenesis is the addition of those myofibrils in parallel, or sarcomeres in parallel inside those myofibers. So those are two very different things. So if a muscle can get stretch-mediated hypertrophy, first off, number one, it has to have a length-to-tension relationship that says that it can. Not all muscles do. This is not a debatable thing. Either the sarcomeres have reached out to a length to where titin is lengthened and creates passive tension, or that doesn't happen. That's the length-to-tension relationship. Mm-hmm. It's not the fiber length, it's the working sarcomere length. Okay, so those are two different things. There is a relationship there, so clearly you have to lengthen a muscle for the sarcomeres to get lengthened, but just because the muscle is lengthened doesn't mean it's like this one-to-one relationship between, oh, the muscle's lengthened, so the sarcomeres are lengthened. Not always. Okay. As you get these adaptations from stretch-mediated hypertrophy, where they start adding sarcomeres in a series, what happens is over time, this should make sense to you, is that then the sarcomeres don't lengthen out as far as they previously did because there's more in a row now. Mm. So as you lengthen them, they don't lengthen as far. So before, if you just had like, we're just going to say 4. It's a lot more than that. But let's say you have 4, and they get lengthened out very far. But then you keep doing longer length muscle movements, and then sarcomerogenesis keeps adding these sarcomeres in the series. Now they don't lengthen out as far. So there's less passive tension that occurs, which means eventually what happens is stretch-mediated hypertrophy comes to a halt and it stops happening.
And then for the audience here, approximately how long would you say it takes before those adaptations have fully occurred to the max that you're going to get?
So in some of the research where they have measured fascicle lengths, that's what it comes back to, generally the proxy for understanding if sarcomerogenesis happened, stretch-mediated hypertrophy. So everybody can kind of get in their mind, sarcomerogenesis is the same thing as stretch-mediated hypertrophy. Right? Okay. It's the same things. Mm-hmm. And we measure it by looking at fascicle length measurements. Generally speaking, when we have done looking at like every couple of weeks, somewhere between 6 to 8 weeks or so, we start seeing that plateau out to where it's just no longer occurring. So if you wanted to take kind of one of those best guess kind of things, after your first 6 months of training, whatever stretch mediated hypertrophy adaptations you're going to have, you already are going to have.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, if you're training all your muscles using a variety of strength training exercises and training them along your links, if those muscles that you're training can benefit from those type of adaptations, you're pretty much going to have all that you're going to get within the first 6 months of your training.
Okay. Which then leads me to a more practical application, because obviously we're talking through a lot of theory and a lot of stuff that it's not going to be something that necessarily you talk through these things and then all of a sudden you're getting the biggest muscles in the world. So how could you use this to your benefit? Or is it something that you can't even use to your benefit to change the way that you're training? Or is it something that is more of just a head knowledge thing that most athletes are just they're going to get it whether they try for it or not?
So I think one of the things that's been going around is like you're going to add all this muscle from the length and partials stuff, right?
Mm.
That's just not true. So if you're a beginner and you go in and you do length and partials, you'll probably get more growth than the guy who's doing maybe the full ROM for the muscles that benefit from stretching mediated hypertrophy, because of the fact that you're kind of staying in that range of motion where you're going to have the greatest amount of passive tension that's occurring with that active tension. Whereas you're doing the full range of motion, you're not spending as much time in that passive tension range. So it's kind of lessened. So when you look across the studies where they use these beginners and they were doing length and partial movements compared to a full range of motion movement, or say a short and partial, do well for actually the triceps showed more growth at a short and partial, but we can get into that too. So the triceps don't benefit from stretch mediated hypertrophy. We know that. We have an abundance of studies that prove that.
Careful.
For sure. No,
is it the Matteo study that everybody likes to point to?
The Mayo study. Mayo.
Yeah,
that one.
Like that.
Yeah, that one. Yeah. Anytime that I get somebody to try to debate me on that one though, it's so easy to corner them, because they're like, well, the triceps showed more growth from this overhead position. Mm-hmm. I go, okay, so the lateral and medial head were not stretched, and they showed more growth in the overhead position. Why did that happen? So then their response is, if they're kind of smart, will be, well, the long head is disadvantaged in that overhead
meaning
position.
That they work harder.
This is called neuromechanical matching, right? So your body will allocate more motor units to whatever has the most leverage there. Or if something is disadvantaged and there's something else that crosses that joint and can articulate that joint, it will allocate more motor units to do the work. So if the idea was the long head was at a disadvantage in this overhead position, the lateral and medial head will grow more because they're not stretched. But the long head grew more too, so it couldn't have grown from stretch. You see how like they can't...
it's the two are conflicting with each other.
Yes, absolutely. And then somebody else actually told me they contacted the researchers and they said they theorized that it grew more from a hypoxia.
Yeah, that's what I thought they came to the conclusion.
If you actually go in and read the study,
it's weird.
If you read the study themselves, the researchers say they can't rule out stretch. The wild thing about that particular study is that everybody's going around saying it's from stretch, but the researchers never actually say in the actual study themselves they think it grew from stretch. They said it just can't be ruled out.
Yeah, they just basically just say they don't, or in an overhead position, I think is how they worded it.
The title is the triceps grew more in overhead position because they couldn't say it grew more from stretch because the lateral and medial head are not stretched.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so when this study was actually, it wasn't a replicated study, but another study was done very similar to this one using length and partials. The Stanislavski study was done using length and partials in an overhead position, and it was literally a length and partial compared to a push down using 4-inch motion, and it was the same growth. And there were no fascicle length increases in the overhead position. So the triceps did not benefit from stretch mediated hypertrophy in that study. And then there's another study the FSC7 study where they actually stretched the triceps and biceps along with using an overhead triceps exercise, and they measured the fascicle lengths in that one too, and they said there was no fascicle length increasement in the triceps. That's with a stretch and an overhead triceps extension. So it didn't happen there. Then there was a study from 95, and then people didn't like that one because there was only 5 people in it, but they measured fascicle length, cross-sectional area, pennation angle, everything. And they said the fascicle length didn't increase after 16 weeks of overhead triceps extensions.
Mm-hmm.
And there were no fascicle length increasements. It's rock solid. The triceps do not grow more from stretch. That one's not debatable. And then the other study that actually showed the opposite was one where they did a skull crusher, and they did a full range of motion skull crusher versus a 90 to 45. So it was a mid to short, and that one grew more than the full range.
Yeah, I remember.
That falls in line. Here's the interesting part about the triceps.
Mm-hmm.
All of that falls exactly in line with their length to tension relationships because the triceps are just on the plateau, which means they experience the greatest amount of tension at those mid-range motions.
Okay.
So if you understand that they don't benefit from stretch, all of those here's the cool thing about actually having a model that makes all this fit. If you simply look at the triceps architecture and you look where it has leverage, then all of the other studies make 100% sense. The one study that all the stretch guys love so much, that one makes no sense and can't be explained by the researchers. But I'm here unequivocally saying I'm doubling down on the fact that the triceps don't grow more from stretch, and you don't have a study saying otherwise. That isn't what that says.
So obviously we talked through like all of the different studies and what they showed and stuff like that. Your practical takeaway from something like that, do you feel like overhead work is in any sense necessary to develop your best triceps?
I think because this is a pretty funny comment, one of the guys trying to challenge Chris on the 16-week overhead that didn't show fascicle length, it showed triceps growth, right? So I think people misconstrue that saying, and like, well, they don't grow more. They don't get these adaptations. They don't get those adaptations, the stretch-mediated adaptations. It doesn't mean they don't grow.
Right.
Because there's still a concentric contraction, so you still get concentric contraction adaptations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? You still get those. So if you like overhead triceps extension, you can use overhead triceps extension, but it's not a long head exercise. Long head will grow. Like people have always said forever, this is more long head. It's not more long head. It's less long head,
Mm-hmm.
right? The long head is at a disadvantage there.
And it's going to be more long head as you bring your arm down
Closer
further.
down towards the body. And
Mm-hmm.
that has to do with the fact that the long head crosses the shoulder. So when you have the arm overhead, there's an internal moment arm to do shoulder extension by the triceps long head. So that means that it actually gets more taut around the elbow. So it has less ability to extend the elbow when the arm is it's in that overhead position.
Sure.
So when you bring it down, it's actually more shorter there. It can actually produce a better moment arm at the elbow. And that's all been looked at.
All right. So building off of that, if we're flipping it over, talking about the other side of the arm, the biceps.
The bicep.
So a lot of times
We had those studies in a row. I was in the airport, and one time, and you started DMing me,
Uh-huh.
and it was the incline dumbbell
Incline versus the preacher.
preacher, and you're like, what happened here? And I was like, well, just look at the resistance profile. Remember what I told you? And I started quoting something, and you said, where are you at? I mean, I'm at the airport, and you said, how do you know all this? I was like, I just memory.
Mm-hmm.
You remember that? It was a pretty funny conversation.
Oh yeah, because I was trying to figure out where you were pulling your information from, and it was just
Yeah,
You
you're like, where are
remember
you at? I'm like,
these.
I'm in the airport, and I'm like, I'm just telling you, like, because I actually sent you the studies, and you're like, how did you find these that quick? I'm like, just memory.
yeah.
Yeah. So I'm like, did you look at the resistance profile? And then I said, look at it for a little while. I was like, it's the same study as those preacher curl studies where they loaded them at the bottom and then loaded them at the top. It's the same study, just using different exercises.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, the preacher curl study showed the biceps grew better because with the barbell or dumbbell preacher curl, the resistance profile is descending. So it drops off as you get closer right up here because of the external moment arm. So it's heavy down here where the biceps have the most leverage.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're doing an incline dumbbell curl, right, and you're down here, when you're curling up to here, it doesn't get heavy until you're right here, and it's hard at the top. So when they did those preacher curl studies, they would break it apart into 2 ranges of motion. So you did a preacher curl where you loaded it up to 60 degrees, 68 degrees, I think it was. It's a fully extended elbow to 68 degrees.
Yeah.
And I remember laughing at the time. I'm like, that's exactly range of motion where the biceps brachii have the most leverage and elbow flexion. If you have a supinated forearm, it's up to around 90.
Okay.
If you have a neutral forearm position, it's around 70.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody was screaming, stretch mediated hypertrophy, longer muscle links. There's a growing body of evidence shows everything grows better at longer muscle links.
Mm-hmm.
God, I got so tired. I'm so tired of hearing that phrase because I'm like, that's not what that shows.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, I just point to the Murray study. I'm like, here's the Murray study. Here's where they measure all the forearm, the elbow flexors. Look where the biceps has the most leverage. Wow, look at that. It's 0 to around 90.
Mm-hmm.
So if you load a preacher curl in the bottom part and then you load it in the top part, if they would have taken 2 measurements, that study would have been over if they would have measured the biceps brachii compared to the brachioradialis, because the brachioradialis has the most leverage in that top part.
Mm-hmm.
If they would have taken 2 measurements, they would have been like, oh, that makes sense. And nobody would have run around saying the biceps grow better at longer lengths. They do. They do. But not because of stretch mediated hypertrophy. It is because that's where they have the most leverage as you're going through joint angle ranges of motion and elbow flexion.
Mm-hmm. So for anybody who got lost in the mix in what we're talking about here, basically, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, what you're saying is if you're doing a preacher curl, right, and you're lowering your arm down, yes, the biceps might be growing better at those longer lengths when you're working from the longer length up to here. But the reason for that is not because of sarcomerogenesis or what we call stretch-mediated hypertrophy, adding sarcomeres in a series, but it would be more from the fact that the biceps have good leverage down here, which is going to cause more radial growth.
100%.
Correct?
Yep.
Okay.
We don't have a single, no, you nailed it. We don't have a single bicep study that has actually measured the fascicle length. So in all fairness, it's difficult because I actually talked to some of the researchers. You need an extended field of view ultrasound, and not everybody always has access to that, but it can be difficult to get that particular measurement. But if we get measurements, and I've always said this to people, if we start getting measurements and they're looking at fascicle lengths and we got fascicle length increasing in the biceps brachii from doing that, I'll be like, hey, we got that wrong.
Okay.
I'm not.
So your position is more, we have no evidence to suggest that it does, not that there could never be any evidence.
I'm like that about all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at the biceps brachii, it looks like it touches like the edge of the descending limb, which means it's possible that it could get like the tiniest amount of passive tension, but it definitely does not extend onto the descending limb. So for people who are lost again, if a muscle has a length-to-tension relationship where those working sarcomeres extend down onto the descending limb, that's a way to express that it gets to a longer length, then it'll have more passive tension. So the biceps don't look like they do that. So when people do these and they load them at a longer length, I'm like, we have to ask ourselves, anytime we're doing any of these studies, what muscle has the most leverage in the range of motions you're testing? Are you measuring those? Are you just measuring? This was another one that came up. I think I remember sending you this one. I did. I was like, because you sent me one, and I said, Joel, did you go back and look and see if they tested the forearm flexors or did they measure the biceps? Remember that?
Right. I do remember that one.
And I said, did they measure the forearm flexors or the biceps? And you came out, you said, oh, they measured the flexor. So I was like, right, it's just they don't know. They just, some shit grew in there.
Right. They got thicker.
They got thicker, right? Like, so, okay, they measured, they had an elbow flexor measurement. They didn't measure the biceps brachii. So that's kind of a tricky one with those studies. You have to go in and look. And that was my question back to you. I go, did they measure the elbow flexors or the biceps brachii?
Location X.
Yes.
Location X is what they measured.
Right.
No.
So they're just, exactly. So you have to, there's kind of some nuance, right, that comes with that stuff where people, do you see how, though, it's really funny if somebody can take some research, though, and start saying stuff that technically maybe is not true. They'll be like
spreads.
And then if you don't understand the nuances, then you just get pulled in and sucked into. And then if you become one of those tribal guys, that's your guy because he knows all the stuff. Then you just start repeating that stuff, and it's hard to get it through other guys' head. That's not what the actual science said.
Right. And the problem is you're essentially playing a game of telephone at that point. And then
How that goes.
one word gets left out here, one word gets left out here, a little bit of context left out here, and then suddenly I have
Changing the one word often changes the whole thing.
Insane.
Whole things.
I have had people tag me in other people's comment sections to come help them with an argument that they're having with somebody else, and they're wrong. Like they're the people who are tagging me to come in. They're the ones who are wrong, and I'm like, this is not what I said.
Yep.
And they'll be like, no, you said this in this study, in this particular video. I'll go back to the video and I'm like, maybe I said something wrong, and I'll be like, no, you rearranged these words, and it doesn't work anymore.
Or they read stuff and they don't understand how all this fits together, but then they just kind of take a sound bite of some stuff you said, and then they jargle it in a way they think they understand it. Like that's why I think that the muscle gets torn down and built back bigger. It got repeated for so long because physiology is complex and messy and complicated. But if I just tell you muscles torn down, built back bigger, you're like, man, that's easy to remember and it sounds good.
Very easy to remember.
Yeah, but that's not how it happens.
That's how I thought it worked for the first 15 years of my athletic career. The number of bro science things that I just believed all the way up and never questioned whatsoever.
Wrong with that. All of us went through. I really kind of call it an awakening, where you finally are like at a point where you find the right people, the right data, the right studies. You start understanding things better, and you do kind of have an awakening. You're like, whoa, I didn't really know anything at all. I was repeating a lot of bullshit. But getting back to so that way we don't get too far off base. So there's a massive difference there in understanding. You have to look and say, does this muscle have a length-to-tension relationship where it will benefit from a longer length? If it does, cool. That means I'm going to get some stretch-mediated hypertrophy out of it for a couple months, and then that's it, as a beginner.
Now, I will say this.
Or if you're an advanced guy and haven't been training that range of motion.
I was just going to say, is there a period of time where somebody who is a bit more advanced, or even somebody who has previously done the work to get those adaptations, how much would you say that they need to keep up with it?
They do. You still need to train. So that's a lot of things that people say. They'll use the worthless card on me. I think that's so funny that you and I talked about that we had the same words that we find very annoying that they use. Worthless, or what's the other one?
Always, never.
Always, never, but then the worthless one. So you're saying this is worthless. No, I never used that. I didn't say that word. Pointless. So see, Paul said it's pointless.
Or you're saying you shouldn't do this. It's like, I never said
I didn't say that.
Yeah.
So you do have to still use lengthened motions for muscles who got those adaptations to basically retain them or maintain those adaptations.
Really?
And we have some really cool research, actually. One of the ones, and I'll bring up, there's going to be some new research that's going to come out that's going to validate pretty much everything I've said for the past, I don't know how many years, about stretch-mediated hypertrophy. That's going to it's going to be the game, the end game. It's the Thanos snap kind of.
Just remember when you present it that you have to keep it digestible for the audience. Otherwise,
it's going to be the Thanos snap, and it's going to. All the guys that were saying all the stuff that have made content, like taking shots at me or whatever, it's pretty much the game ender for them. And I know that they know that it is because I happened to have a conversation with one of them yesterday, and he pretty much admitted, he's like, yeah, it's pretty much the game ender, and you had it. So that felt pretty good.
Yeah.
So, but back to that, you'll still need to train stuff like pecs. Because people go, always question, which are the ones that grow better along the least? Well, dude, have you been training for 2 years? You already trained them.
Right.
But probably the pecs, the quads, the adductors, the glutes, the hamstrings.
Pretty much all lower body muscles.
The way that I always say it is all lower body and pecs, to keep it simple.
Yep.
I said that to Chris one day. He goes, if you want to phrase it that way, that's okay. And I'm like, well, that's what it is. Pretty much there's the delts, the lateral delts potentially could.
Okay.
If you could pixelate your arm somehow to get it to go through your body like Dr. Manhattan.
Yeah.
So if,
It's just hard to get a stretch position.
Yeah, so you really can't get much of a stretch position.
Right.
Because it's a monoarticulate joint muscle. You're not going to really be able to stretch. You have about 5 muscles in your body you can actually stretch.
Right.
So you can lengthen, but you're not really, and I don't think people need to worry about that anyway, right? Like I said before, 90 plus 95, 97, 98% of your growth is going to be that radial growth is going to be myofibril and parallel, which is going to come mostly from your moderate lengths. That's where you're going to get all the greatest amount of your growth anyway.
So you hear that? Practical applications. If you think that stretch-mediated hypertrophy is going to be the silver bullet that gets you from making no gains to being the next Ronnie Coleman, not the case. Or at least that's not something that we've ever seen within any of the literature. So take it with a grain of salt.
The stuff they keep saying that's in the literature, it's all done on noobs. So I'm like, okay,
makes sense.
You'll keep seeing that, and guess what? It's all done on muscles we'd expect to see that from. They don't have any for the triceps. They keep saying when they have the one, the Milo study is horse shit. You do not have one for the triceps. We do have a bunch for the triceps that show they don't. Okay, we don't have any fascicle length measurements for the biceps. We have some loading preacher curls halfway up and then halfway all the way up and breaking the range of motions in half. So we're loading the biceps where they have the most leverage in one, and then the brachioradialis where it's loading it where it has the best leverage. So all that study is proving is neuromechanical matching. That's it. It's not proving anything else. So we have one lat study on longitudinal hypertrophy that didn't look at any of that stuff. Believe it or not, you never even thought about that, have you? There's no lat studies out there that looked at stuff like cross-section area. We just have one. I found it recently. We only have one. So we have almost nothing on the lats, but we have a metric butt ton of EMG stuff on the lats, and we have a ton of stuff looking at the leverage that the lats have, crossing the shoulder, different joint angles. We have basically the Ackland study is the gold standard. It's never needed to be repeated because it was done so well by Dave Ackland, who's like the Michael Jordan of stuff that crosses the shoulder. So he literally had a whole apparatus built just for that stuff and got a bunch of cadaver arms and put it in this apparatus and tested it every way, including for humeral rotation and all that kind of stuff. So the study's never really been challenged because it's just that damn good. It's one of those that damn good studies where you're like, we don't need another one because this one did it all. And we got everything we need.
I think that's one of the fundamental things that people misunderstand about science, because I'll often, if I put forward a study to somebody that's from 96 or something like that,
they'll say
it's outdated. And what you need to understand about science is science doesn't work on a spectrum of when it was made. It works on a spectrum of, has there been something that's been made since that has disproven it? So,
well, not only that, but stuff like we have, is this repeatable? Do we have other data that shows this repeatable? Stuff with like anatomy and stuff, as far as I know, like anatomy really hasn't changed that much.
Yeah.
So, like, in other words, if we have some really good internal moment arm studies on stuff like shoulders, glutes, adductors, hamstrings. Like, we don't need to keep doing them. You know what I'm saying? Right. Like, you do them on like 20 different cadavers, and you're like, okay, this is what we're looking at. Like, they're all pretty similar. So, with that kind of stuff, with like internal leverages, we don't need to. Somebody says like, oh, that study's from 97. I'm like, so perfectly good. The date of the study is not really relevant. Like you said, if there's been new technology that has shown us something new that says this is not it, that's great.
Yeah.
But when it comes to a lot of those kind of things, in fact, a lot of we have studies going back when I first started working with Chris, and I was getting to the point where I was looking at a lot of the stuff for his, like the modeling he laid out. I would be reading this one study and reading a study on Titan. And I'm like, this is 1959. And the study on Titan from 1959 is exactly the same stuff we already see in the current research. So, like, that stuff, biologically, it doesn't change. It's like, there may be some new way we can look at stuff. Like, we do probably need slightly better technology for literally looking at sarcomeres, in vivo.
Right.
Comparison to having to do biopsies all the time on stuff. but we're pretty good. Extended view ultrasound gives us a pretty good look at fascicles and stuff like that. So we're pretty good in that aspect. Like, could it always be better? But yes, it could.
Yeah.
But like a lot of the stuff, I know what you're talking about. So when people ring up, well, this study is from whatever year, I'm like, is it a good study?
Has the anthropomorphology changed?
Anthropometry. Has it changed? Did that change? Or did we go from like the caveman, whatever? From like,
do we no longer have the same tendons and ligaments that we had when that study was conducted?
And so whenever that kind of stuff comes up, like somebody will be like, well, this date is from whatever, this study is from whatever date. I'm like, so I don't really put a lot of, an older study can be obsolete because we know new information.
Exactly.
But not because
you need that paradigm.
But an older study can still be completely valid because it's just, we've had multitude of studies that still validate and replicate what they found then too.
Well, I remember somebody trying to argue with me. I can't remember exactly what the study was, but the study that I was presenting was from 2012. And they said, well, this was disproven by this study in 2018. And I'm like, no, because the 2012 study was actually better made. It was, it was actually like the whole structure of it, the outcomes, the way they went about it was all better than the 2018
The
study.
Stesnaski study on triceps was way better than my study.
And people assume a more recent year must disprove a previous year.
It has nothing to do with it. There's so many things that come into play there. Like forever and ever, the kind of the landmark study for longitudinal hypertrophy was the Ostrowski study, and it was done in the 90s. So forever and ever, there's some problems with it too. But overall, like that was a landmark volume study that was used forever because it was done really well. So the year doesn't always have anything to do with it. It's like there's lots of current studies that have come out that there's all sorts of problems with.
Right. Well, that's why I laugh when somebody says, but this study came out in 2023. And I'm like, okay, but what is the study?
Yeah.
How was it made?
52-week volume study that just came out. And that nothing that there's wrong with that study. I'm just saying that doesn't mean that you need to do 52 sets.
Right.
It didn't prove that.
Right.
That's not what that study said. So the other one that comes up, because you'd asked me about, was the lats. Do the lats grow? So a lot of people, way too much emphasis put on that they feel their lats stretch, and that I even heard somebody say that stretch can overcome a lack of leverage. Wow.
That's a bold statement.
That's a bullshit statement. It's not.
I was being polite.
I know. I'm not going to be polite. That's a bullshit statement. Okay, so here's how leverage works. There's a multitude of other problems with the stretch mediated hypertrophy people. So, if for a muscle to experience tension, it first has to be active. Okay. Now I've heard people try to debate that non-active fibers can still experience tension by way of it being transmitted transversely through the costomeres. That's just some made up shit. Okay. So I've heard somebody say that, and I'm probably going to address that soon because it's somebody I don't like. But it's been said, and there's absolutely zero evidence to prove it, but the force is transmitted laterally through the costomeres. Okay, there's literally, when I say zero evidence, there's nothing that even suggests that's possible. So for a muscle to experience tension, it has to be active. Okay? For the central motor command in the brain to allocate action potentials to activate those fibers, for them to be active, they have to have leverage. That's how neuromechanical matching works. Your brain wants to be efficient. Everything in your body wants to be efficient, right? That you do from a physiological standpoint because it wants to keep you alive. So if you're going to activate a muscle, right? Your brain says, I'm going to activate these fibers. They need leverage because if they have leverage, then they have efficiency to perform that motion. So in order for them to experience tension, passive tension or active tension, they need to be active. And for them to be active, they have to have leverage. If there's no leverage, then EMG is pretty good for giving us some feedback about that because it shows action potentials for that muscle at different joint angle ranges of motion. We have tons and tons and tons and tons of data, EMG data on the lats. So as the arm starts going overhead, the lats just start dropping. They just start dropping off.
Well, I remember when I first heard that, I thought there's got to be a way to test this on yourself. There has to be a way.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I did was I just went over to a door frame and I put my hand up on the door frame and I tried to push against it to see what would happen. And I felt my lat while I did it, and I couldn't really activate my lat well trying to push down in that motion. But my chest was activating very well.
It's like, no, I can do this.
Yeah, like my chest is like, I'll take this. I'll take this motion for you.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So as you get your arm overhead, the funny one is we have 4 different pullover studies that all showed the exact. I love replication. If you give me a study from like 91, 98, 2015, 2020, and they're all doing the same thing and they all find the same thing, I'm like, that's good.
Yeah,
we know what we need to know. So there's at least 4, they're dumbbell or barbell pullover studies, and they looked at all the triceps, the pecs, and the lats. And in all of them, the lats ain't doing shit.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so the arms overhead where the resistance is greatest, and then as it comes over and the resistance is dropping off because it's over the top of your body, your joints are stacked, where the lats just start getting leverage, the resistance drops off. So they're doing nothing. Mm-hmm. Okay? So for a muscle to experience tension, it has to be active. And one of the studies, and you always have less activation on the eccentric in regular dynamic repetitions anyway, right? Because there's a much lower degree of activation because you can lower 130% more of what you can raise anyway, right? So the degree of motor unit recruitment is way lower for the eccentrics. It's like 8%. The lats were like 8% on the EMG, on the lowering motion, like 8%. Yeah. And they were only like 20% on the raising, 25%. There was like 8%. They're doing nothing. So one of the lengthened partial groups that were literally running around saying dumbbell pullovers are a great lat exercise. Literally not even a lat exercise. It's a great lat exercise for lengthened partials. They're not doing anything. Mm-hmm. So for the lats to get stretch mediated hypertrophy, they would have to have leverage. So it looks like that thoracic division, that very top division up here, right? The one up there at the very top on the thoracic part of the spine. It looks like they might have a length tension relationship to do it, but guess which one runs out of leverage first as you start raising your arm? That division.
Yeah.
So they would be the least active. So those
would there be a way? So obviously that would mean that this is out of the question, but would there be another way to possibly induce that through something that's coming across the body?
Well, not across the body, because it's taking the arm across the body. Is a lot of people think that feels like it's more of a stretch, but what you're actually really doing there is you're just maximizing your protraction. And so since the lats do cross part of the scapula, when you do protraction, they do lengthen, right? So anytime you do these motions, they do lengthen. So there's the slim possibility that thoracic division could potentially get some stretch mediated hypertrophy through like a row where you have a lot of protraction going on. But do I think, here's the thing that people are going to continue to keep missing in this discussion.
Is it significant?
It's number one, yeah, it's significant. It's going to be beginners. Mm-hmm. So you're not needing to base your training off trying to run after these adaptations. They're limited in how much you're going to get and in time span. So for your training status, if you're a beginner to if you're an intermediate, you've probably already got them, mm-hmm. right? So again, it comes back to unless you have not been training through some particular longer range of motion with muscles that are going to get those. So,
except for the one muscle group that we talked about, in which case we're not even dealing with stretch mediation, if I'm not mistaken.
You're going to say the calves.
The calves.
Yeah, the calves don't benefit from stretch mediated hypertrophy, and somebody's out there having a conniption fit now because I've made so many posts about how the calves are going to grow best in stretch. They are. We have repeatable data that shows over and over again basically the only way they're going to grow is in stretch. So this is actually the same conversation is like if stretch-mediated hypertrophy is a type of adaptation, which is sarcomerogenesis, that means for that to occur, you have to have a length-to-tension relationship where the working sarcomere length extends out to the descending limb. The calves don't have that.
Mm-hmm.
So to refer to the audience, the funny conversation I had with you that I'd actually had with Chris Beardsley is Chris had sent me another study on the calves where they grew from stretch, and it was stretch back to 0 degrees of like ankle position. So we're in a neutral position.
Yeah.
No dorsiflexion, no plantar flexion. So it was from a dorsiflex position and the plantar flex back to 0. And they grew a bunch compared to, I think it was like the short, and there was a short.
Yeah,
partial.
people who just went up under their
There was a
tiptoes,
short partial, and then there was a full romp.
Mm-hmm.
Then there was like the people who did the neutral to the short got almost nothing.
Yeah.
Which is repeatable in another study. So it's really clear the only way you're going to grow your calves is with that stretch, right? So he sends me this that also measured the working sarcomere length in the study. And I'm looking at the length-to-tension relationship on the graph, and it's just got the dots on the ascending limb. So it doesn't even get to the plateau. And I'm looking at it, and Chris is like right there on video, and I'm looking at it. And I said, they grew more in the stretch to neutral. And he's like, mm-hmm. And I go, they're only on the ascending limb of the length of tension relationship. And he's like, yeah. And I go, how did that happen? And he goes, I don't know. So he and I have kind of been on a quest to figure out now, in this stretch, when you're in a dorsiflex position with the ankle, the gastroc does have the most leverage.
Mm.
But there's other weird stuff going on with the calves we haven't figured out. So when people start asking me about the calves, I just go, I don't know. Mm-hmm. Everything else fits perfectly.
Right.
They're an anomaly. So I've had the conversation with him too about like the forearm stuff, because I think the forearms and calves look to be the two muscle groups that appear to be really, really genetically, like seriously genetically, either you got them or you don't. I think you can work to build calves, and I think the research has shown that, like through the stretch, right? Like they was able to grow calves really good.
I was gonna say you're about to go against everything I've said about the calves, because I'm telling people they can grow them.
Yeah, I mean, but the thing is, it's like I grew my calves. I had no calves. I posted the pictures where I had the biggest calves.
I had spindly.
Dude, I had no calves.
Yeah.
I grew my calves. People, I get that comment all the time now in person now. Like, must be nice people. I was like, no, I grew those. Mm-hmm. I worked very hard for those. My forearms I did nothing for. Mm-hmm. Like, I've never done anything.
I mean, that's, yeah.
And I've never done anything for them, right? And so then I have heard from people that have grown good forearm size from training or whatever. I just think it's possible there's some stuff going on there we just don't quite understand yet with the calves for sure. But it's not stretch-mediated hypertrophy.
What do you think of the, because I've heard people theorize this before. I've heard people theorize the whole kind of the body likes to remain more proportionate. So you're saying like forearms might be kind of tough to grow from a genetic standpoint. But what people will say is, well, as long as you grow your biceps and your triceps, your forearms will kind of come along for the ride.
I guess they forgot to tell Kai Green that.
Yeah. I never even thought about that before, but now that I think about it, yeah.
Really, you've never noticed?
No, I hadn't until you just said it. Now I'm thinking about
Kai Green
his shape.
He has no forearms.
That is interesting.
Yeah, he has no forearms. And what's funny is somebody pointed out to me recently, Larry Wills doesn't either. And
his grip strength obviously is not.
Really, he's done tons of arm wrestling grip strength.
Yeah.
Right. He has really small forearms comparatively to his arms. And Larry is, of course, a freak.
Right.
So I think there's definitely, and I didn't even know this was like the last year I started getting all these forearm questions. And I'm not saying it's like because of my forearms. I'm saying I started getting them so much. I'm like, why are dudes asking so much about forearms?
Do you not know why?
I really.
Okay, so there's a big push on social media recently, especially within the last 5 years or so, to do something that a lot of people refer to as like looks maxing, and that's essentially like trying to make yourself more appealable to the opposite sex.
Okay,
And their thought is like, okay, well, if you have good forearms, then like, because women are very attracted to nice forearms and stuff like that. So that's why
I've heard this was a theory that I heard.
it's the, as if I'm still wearing sleeves, how do I look appealable? So they think they can just grow them separately from everything else and just have these massive Popeye forearms.
I think this is also under the lines of John Meadows. John had said the look of power, and he had a really similar concept. And he was like, there's certain muscles, if you grow them, almost no matter what you wear, you can still look jacked.
Mm-hmm.
And his was traps, rear delts, forearms, and calves.
Yep.
So he's like, think about it. I guess I remember because, like, I don't know if most people, not everybody knows, John was my best friend for like almost 10 years. And like we traveled all over the world together and talked every week and everything. But we'd have these funny conversations, and John would be like, he's like, the look of power. And we'd get us and it's like, you know what that is? And I'm like, what? He's like, well, it's got to be traps and rear delts. I'm like, rear delts? He's like, got to be rear delts, big rear delts. He was so huge on rear delts. Like,
Yeah.
why rear delts? He's like, because he goes, if you're in a tank top, he goes, I'm telling you, what makes the physique pop, like if you're in a tank top, is big, like popping out rear delts. He goes, that's what makes the shoulder look the most capped. And I'm like, okay, that's probably pretty true. Because like if you got big rear delts, when you get, he goes, that line from the back, you know what I'm talking about, the line from the back?
Oh, yeah.
He's like, that looks so good, John. So funny. He goes, that looks so good. And so then he goes on and on. He goes, but it's got to be forearms and calves.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, okay, so I'm listening. And he's like, well, he goes, if you're out and you're just in like some shorts and a t-shirt and you got big calves and forearms, still look jacked.
Mm-hmm.
People can tell you're jacked. I'm like, okay.
Your shirt's lifted if you have the traps.
Right.
Well,
So like if you wanted to focus on having like that look of, it would be the anti-sleeper build, right? It would essentially be
the opposite.
The anti-sleeper
Yep.
build is traps, rear delts, forearms, and calves.
Yeah.
So if you just want to do those, because you could have big quads and hide them in sweatpants, but if you got cut off sweatpants, you got big calves, you look jacked. If you got big forearms, you can pretty much wear any short sleeve shirt, pull your sleeves up, right? And traps like finish it off.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much the look of power.
There's a guy, I don't know if you're familiar with, you probably are, Alex Leonidas.
Yes.
Yeah, he what did he term it as?
The arm wrestling guy, right? Or he did some.
I think he might have done some, but he called it the yoked look.
Yeah.
The yoked look was his thing, and it was always about the traps and the neck. And
it is. Neck, I've never heard. Okay, so
that got popular for a little while, was the neck training.
So I definitely, I'll say for sure. Okay, once I put this up, I had never heard any women say they liked big forearms.
Okay. I
had never heard that.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a mixed review of DMs from ladies that were like, some of them said they did notice, but it wasn't like none of them said that was like the thing. Mm-hmm. Some of them said they did notice, but it wasn't a deal breaker. Plenty of others said they'd never even heard that before. Mm-hmm. I think that sometimes what happens is they make these articles online about muscular stuff and dudes read them and it catches wildfire and runs off, but it's not necessarily true.
Yeah. So
I've clearly lifted for a long time. At no point in my life have I ever heard chicks are into big forearms.
It's the classic guys view it as something powerful and therefore assume girls will as well.
Dude, that's a real thing.
Very real.
That's a real thing. If there's anything that you need to get out of this podcast, they need to understand the thing about women, right? And the thing about women is women do not view physiques the way we view it. And what we do is we project exactly what you said. You nailed it. That is, if we see something this way, then we say the women have to also see it this way too. Mm-hmm. So if a dude is jacked, like shredded, whatever, we're like, holy crap, that dude looks amazing, whatever. Then a dude thinks women have to be after that kind of man.
Yeah.
That's a real thing.
Yeah. Whereas
women are way more emotionally like motivated. Mm-hmm. Like if a guy can make her laugh, if like he can, like appeal to her emotions, if he has a emotional intellect, there's a multitude of things that guy can bring to the table to get a really hot woman that have nothing to do with his physique.
Absolutely.
I'm not saying that having a great physique isn't a nice bonus, but it's kind of like more icing on the cake for the woman.
Right.
Right. But if he can make her laugh, if he, comes across as confident, if he comes across as intelligent, if he's well articulated, there's so many things along the list, and has a good smile, is charismatic. There's like a million things that'll light up the woman's dopamine receptors as to this is a good guy to be with for me, outside of just having like neck tattoos and abs.
Yeah. That is absolutely true. And
because how many times do you see that dude that's clearly like a 210 with like the absolute like most smoking woman you've ever seen? You see that, right?
Yeah.
Right. So status matters for that a lot. So one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen in my life is I just saw her. It's the UFC CEO's recent wife, and she is, I mean, unbelievably incredible. But if you saw this, he's just an average looking dude, but he's the CEO of the UFC, right?
Yeah.
That's status.
Yeah.
So from like a physique standpoint, even if a dude reads that all these women are after, I've never had a woman tell me one time until this whole topic come up, because I had to put it up. I go, ladies, are you guys after, why am I getting asked about forearm training so much?
Right.
And apparently that was why.
The more serious I got about bodybuilding over the years, the less it became about trying to attract a woman, and the more I was just like, how far could I? How that like it was for myself more than anything. I just want to see what I could accomplish.
I think there's definitely an evolution you go through. Chris Bumstead had that really cool interview recently, and the guy asked him, said, "What is like the percentage of like that you get of like women to like dudes like kind of coming at you about your physique?" He's like 95% dudes.
Oh yeah.
He's like, absolutely. He's like, it's almost nothing but dudes.
Did you ever see that the interview where the person was going around and they would show a picture of Chris Bumstead in the off season versus Chris Bumstead on stage?
Yeah.
A woman, and they'd say what physique do you prefer?
It's always the off season one.
All of them, always the off season.
Yeah.
And they were like, yeah, that's disgusting. Like anytime he was close to stage lean, they're like this. And I remember they even described his off season physique as they said, well, I like the dad bod look. And they viewed his off season.
He calls Chris Bumstead a dad bod.
Dad bod. And I was just like, oh my God.
Dude with possibly the most perfect physique ever in all of bodybuilding, and he has a dad bod.
Yeah.
And
I was like, okay, so this is what girls mean when they say they want dad bods. They're not talking about the pot belly and the no definition on the arms. They're talking about essentially the power build.
Yes.
That is essentially what they're referring to.
So I ran this on Facebook years ago because of this conversation and the dad bod stuff, and I put up a multitude of physique pictures, guys head cut off, and it was the one that got ran away with it was like a power build guy.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a power build, like kind
enough definition that you can see the muscles there, but more just
not
the shredded look. Or
and if you did want to pick one outside of that, do you know which other one I would 100% put money on?
Which one?
It would be the kind of leaner athletic.
Oh yeah.
Like smaller athletic, but like in shape. And if essentially forever, the one that got picked the most by women, when they put them up and they know it was the Brad Pitt Fight Club physique.
Okay.
So Brad was like a $165, but really lean in that movie.
Yeah, they're okay with it being lean as long as it's not too muscular.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I've told guys that. I was like, dude, if you want to build that like chicks are gonna really like, just be like that 15%, like what I call like fuscular. That's the word.
Fuscular.
I use some fuscular. It's like fat.
Right.
It's like fat muscular, right? So you can get chicks like that. Chicks just say, just don't be skinny. Mm-hmm. Don't be skinny. But if you can't get that muscular look, then having kind of that, I don't know or any other kind of phrase to describe it, but that long, lean, tall,
swimmer's build.
It is a swimmer's build, right?
Yeah,
so if you look at Brad Pitt in Fight Club, that's a swimmer's build. Mm-hmm. That's a dude that looks like he's running some marathons. He's doing some CrossFit. He's like doing, I
remember when I first watched that movie thinking he was just jacked. I was like, man, if I could just get that muscular. And now
he looks
he
here's
looks
the
great.
thing. I am not that guy that hates on physiques or whatever. I thought Brad looked great in that movie.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
He looked great. Troy, like there's been times where like Brad is like rocks some pretty amazing scenes. I'm not that guy. Like he's not a bigger dude, right?
Right.
But if you figure he's 6'1", and in Troy he was 185-ish pounds.
Yeah.
He was pretty jacked.
Oh yeah.
Right.
I went through various phases where I wanted the Brad Pitt Fight Club, then I wanted the Brad Pitt Troy.
The Brad Pitt Troy, he was really jacked for him in that.
Yeah, he did a really good job for that.
Yeah.
And then I moved, and then it was Chris Hemsworth, and then it just progressively got to figure him bigger.
Guy, progressively larger every.
Yeah.
Clearly he's on because he's in great shape now. But in the last Thor movie,
He was housed.
he was diesel, as hell. Like people can say whatever scenes were. No, there's video of him walking around on the set,
Right.
where he's absolutely monstrously jacked.
Yeah.
I think he said he was 240 plus pounds for that role, or he was 238 or 240. He was like right around there. That's huge.
Oh yeah.
At 6'4", 235, 240 is huge.
Yeah.
If you're lean.
For that leanness.
He was very lean. So, like, I don't even think chicks dig that look like as much as they would dig like that, like athletic. Another one chicks like, they give you a really good example. This everybody probably don't remember this one, but it was Casino Royale with
Oh yeah.
Daniel
Daniel
Craig. It comes out of the water and women just like totally melt.
They went crazy for that.
and that's a very attainable physique.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know how we went from stretch mediated hypertrophy.
I have no idea.
But it's. I think the people like this.
Oh, the sound bites that we're gonna get from this.
Yeah, the conversation.
People are gonna love this one.
But I think that's the other thing that should give guys. So if guys are training, though, this is a more interesting conversation to me because I talk about all of the other stuff.
Exactly.
If guys that are like listening to this and want to understand like their training, because I think that ultimately that is a part of it, right? Is you still want the attention from women, whether you're getting babes or not. Like to just get attention from girls is a big thing for dudes, right? So if you have physique that you feel like is worthy from, I think if there's anything you should get from that is that you don't need to be a monster.
Yeah. Most of it's going to come down to your nutrition because it's going to come down to your body fat levels.
Yep. So if you can't be that big dude, you can be a muscular dude, and chicks like that.
I have tried to explain to people so many times because they're like, well, I don't like, I've been training for so long and I'm never going to be able to get to be that level of muscle and blah, blah. And they're sitting at 25% body fat. And I'm like, look, like I promise you, if you lose 10% body fat, you are going to love the way you look. Like you are going to be so surprised at the look that you can actually achieve if you just shave off some of that body fat.
Yeah.
And
the first time I got truly paled, like really paled, I was astonished at how different my body looked.
Yeah.
You don't even know.
I mean, I get about 95% of my steroid accusations
when you're lean.
When I'm 8%. 8%,
and you're at your
7%
small
body fat. Yep.
The only time I ever really get accused in person where people start asking me, did you get back on? Is when I get very lean.
Exactly.
People do not understand how much that transformed your physique.
Mm-hmm. I saw you make a comment about the, you said the cap delts thing, and you said you want cap delts, get lean.
Yeah.
And I've because that's what people would say about me. They'd be like, "Well, how did you get capped delts?" And I'd be like, "I got lean."
You get lean.
That you lose the body fat. There's
body fat right there. So when that body fat goes, your delts pop.
Exactly.
And people always assume that, God, they just repeat the same shit. It gets so annoying for me at times. They repeat the same one. Well, all of the androgen receptors are in the delts and traps. Dude, my traps didn't do anything when I got on. They didn't. I was so frustrated because I wanted big ass giant traps. I'm like, when I decided to go dark side, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm gonna turn into Bill Goldberg. I'm gonna have mountains of traps. You ain't gonna be able to hear anything. My trap's gonna be so big. You know what my traps did? Nothing. They didn't do anything. I'm like, where's them androgen receptors at? Like, I'm blasting all this test. I'm doing some DECA. Come on, bro.
I saw one of my clients the other day. He posted a picture of him at 17 years old, and he's on gear now, but like he posted a picture of him at 17 years old, and his shoulders were massive.
Yeah,
and it was like, but everybody would equate his massive shoulders now to the fact that he's on gear, but it was just a genetic strong point for him.
A really good one to see, if most people don't remember, the guy that really put intermittent fasting on the map was Martin Burkham. And if you go look at pictures of Martin, he was peeled. His delts are huge, and he was natural, 100% natural, and he wasn't a huge guy, but because he was so peeled, he looks insane, and his delts are just so. And I've told people that forever. I'm like, if you will cap delts, get as lean as possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Look at football players, look at cornerbacks in the NFL who are just shredded.
Well, I used to, every single time I would see one of them, I'd be like, they're massive. They're massive. And I thought they were so big. And it was leanness.
You meet them in person, dude, and like they totally have a sleeper reel, and like in clothes. I've met tons. I'm friends with tons of NFL players. Not all of them are massive. Some of them are.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, but there's lots of those guys that just look super jacked because they're shredded. They are absolutely peeled. So when you get that peeled, your look changes. It changes everything.
Yep.
So for the guys who are like, I want to transform my physique, I always tell guys that, and that's why I came back to one time, if you're going to do your cut, you get to 7% body fat.
See what you actually have.
Yes.
See what you're working with.
I think, again, because most guys don't know what their physique really looks like because they're afraid to get small, and they don't understand once you get really, really lean, your physique, there's just a massive transformation.
Absolutely. Well, there you go, guys. We went from stretch media hypertrophy to what chicks dig, power builds, and then
Brad Pitt
and Fight Club.
Yeah.
You never know what you're going to get on the EchoCast. But Paul, I want to thank you for taking the time.
Absolutely, bro.
Absolute pleasure, and we'll definitely have you back for a few more segments when we can.
Okay.
And I hope you guys were able to take some away from this, whether it was the stretch media hypertrophy or what chicks like. We got it all here. So thank you for joining in, and we'll talk to you next time.